Essentially, preaching is one of the most important, perhaps the most important form of public speech in Australian history. It's estimated that about 60% of Melbourne's population were regular churchgoers around that time.
Hi, a warm welcome everybody. It's great you could be here. We've got a really interesting thing to listen to this afternoon, and I'm very grateful that Professor Daniel Reynaud is going to be able to share with us. My name is Rob McIver. I am Director of the, and I've got to get it right, Scripture, Spirituality and Society Research Centre. And this is one of our special programs. We're videoing this so that we can perhaps edit it and get it up there available for other people to watch. Anyway, Daniel is going to talk to us about preaching today, so how preaching took place in World War I. Thank you, Daniel. A special welcome to you.
Yes, World War I Anzac history is my interest, and it may seem perhaps a slight diversion to be talking about preaching in Melbourne during World War I, but it came about because I wanted to actually study the sermons that were preached to soldiers. And I've been collecting data on that for a while, but the problem was I had no comparative data. So how did that compare to what was preached at home, both before and during the war? So I had to do my own background research on that. So this is the article before the article. Essentially, preaching is one of the most important, perhaps the most important form of public speech in Australian history. We've got books of political speeches. We have virtually no books of sermons. And yet, it was the most common, the best attended, and probably the most influential form of public discourse in Australia. And a number of historians, not just religious ones, have said we actually need to pay attention. They've said it, but no one has. So I'm looking at preaching that happened in Melbourne. Why Melbourne? Well, a few factors. It was probably Australia's second most religious city after Adelaide. But the real reason is it's got the best data set of sermons. The Melbourne Herald, like many newspapers in Australia, published a weekly column of summaries of the weekend sermons. And it was a full page of sermon summaries and other articles about the churches. And it was called Churches and Congregations, and continued through until early mid-1918. Usually on page 3, I want you to think of the significance of a page 3 thing. But then it got displaced late in the war to pages 11 or 12 or 13, and page 3 was devoted to the new god, the car. I've done a little bit of data crunching and found that there were probably around about 600 clergymen in Greater Melbourne in 1914. Now, if they each preached one sermon a week, we are looking at well over 30,000 sermons a year being preached. And many preachers preached more than one. Some didn't preach any. If you're in the Catholic or Anglo-Catholic tradition, you didn't necessarily preach a sermon. But nevertheless, we're talking about well over 30,000 sermons a year being listened to by up to 60% of Melbourne's population. It's estimated that about 60% of Melbourne's population were regular churchgoers around that time. The Melbourne Herald recorded between 1 and 4 sermons a week. Now, if you're getting 600 plus sermons a week and only 1 to 4 being recorded in the Melbourne Herald, we've obviously got a very small data set. Nevertheless, other newspapers reported on other sermons, and both secular newspapers and church newspapers. So we actually do have a reasonable amount of information about what kinds of sermons were preached. To know something about World War I's impact on preaching. We have to know what preaching was like before the war so we can measure the difference. So I began my study in 1913, and in the months preceding the First World War, so from beginning of 1913 through to early August 1914, the sermons reported were about 50% from the four big denominations. So you're talking Anglican, Catholic, Presbyterian, Methodist. The other 50% were from the also-rans, such as the Congregationalists, the Baptists, the Theosophists, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Churches of Christ, Unitarians, Christadelphians, other small groups like that. So you can see that the sermon coverage was very much biased towards the nonconformist little churches rather than the probably 70 to 80% of those who went to the big four. Nevertheless, when you compare the sermon themes, there's not that big a difference. There's no discernible difference between the kinds of sermons preached in the little nonconformist churches compared to the big four. Four themes emerged from pre-war preaching. The first one was the spiritual life of the Christian. About 50%, more than 50% of the sermons have as their theme, how do I live my Christian life? The next big one was doctrine and apologetics. More than a quarter of the sermons are doctrinal or apologetics. Occasional sermons, about 10%. Now you might wonder why you would have an occasional sermon, but it's actually a sermon about a special occasion, like Easter or Christmas or any other event in the church calendar, or maybe Empire Day, which was the big holiday before we invented Australia Day or Anzac Day. And finally, on morality and ethics, about 6% of the sermons. Pretty well every sermon came with a theme text. That was the way they preached then. You had a theme text, and it was you didn't necessarily preach about the text. It was a departure point rather than a arrival point. 2/3 of the text were from the New Testament, particularly the Gospels. Less than a third from the Old Testament, mainly Isaiah and the Psalms as their favourite ones. The newspaper makes it clear that sermons were widely appreciated. The kind of language they use to describe preachers include highly respected, commanding large congregations as his sermons are helpful and practical. That word helpful keeps popping up again and again and again. So many people back then wrote, it was a helpful sermon. I put that to today's preachers to consider. A preacher of considerable power, another one is spoken of. Another preacher, a young congregation in St Kilda heard a sermon that was masterful, simple and effective. It was considered that 40% of Melbourne University students belonged to the Men's University Christian Association. Quite a statistic. The churches also ran lunchtime services in 15 different venues around the city of Melbourne for working class people who did not have a church near their home. And there could be 1,000 or more at any one of these 15 places. Other services were run on the banks of the Yarra River and again suggested that there was an audience. Workers giving up their lunchtime for a half-hour service. Obviously, Australians are not totally antithetical to religion. So what happened once the war started? Well, the topicality of the war changed the themes. Personal spirituality shrank to about 1/3 of the sermons. But what happened instead of having a single theme was you had a synthesis across spiritual life, morality, occasional and even doctrinal sermons. The war became a way of pulling all of these things together and making them highly topical, super relevant to us today. The war suddenly made religion relevant. And in what ways was it relevant? Well, it wasn't so much personal spirituality that mattered anymore, it was collective spirituality. Because one of the beliefs around the time was God will not grant the Allies victory until the Allies clean up their spiritual and moral act. And so you get these sermons about we've got to start behaving better. We've got to start obeying God's rules and putting aside sin. This was particularly popular with the churches in the holiness and the restorationist traditions, such as Methodist, Salvationist churches of Christ, because of their emphasis on holy behaviour. That's what being a Christian's about. There was also a fourfold increase in occasional sermons in 1915, the first year, full year of the war. And of course, most of the occasions were actual war events. And we see clusters of sermons about the war around significant battles. The landings at Gallipoli, for example. Key battles in 1916. So occasional sermons take off. So do doctrinal sermons, especially sermons on prophecy. So let's look in detail at some of these categories. War sermons, sermons about the war itself, distributed throughout the war, as I mentioned, clustered around major battles, and usually overtly political. Now, there had been political-oriented sermons in peacetime. Empire Day was a great time to go, rah-rah, we're a great empire. God has singled us out to bring Protestantism to the world. British Protestantism, because, of course, God is English. But the war really reinforced this emphasis on politics and religion joining together. Quite a few Australian historians have said, look how pathetic the churches were in Australia during World War I. They just towed the party line and did what the politicians said. There are some historians who are rethinking that, and I agree with them. It wasn't the churches reflecting the politicians, it was actually the politicians reflecting the churches. The churches for many years had advocated this British imperial Protestant Christianity, that God had specially selected the British Empire. How else would you explain a little island off the coast of Europe dominating the world? It must be God's blessing because we're Protestant. And so to be British, to be an imperialist, and to be a Protestant Christian were kind of an indivisible package. And it helped, of course, that there were a couple of things about Germany that made it easy to attack. First of all, Prussian militarism, but secondly, German liberal theology. Germany was the hotspot for liberalism, destroying our faith, higher criticism, and etc. And so it gave the churches a real opportunity to go on the front foot, because defeating Germany wasn't just a political issue; it was actually a spiritual issue. If Germany won, autocracy and religious libertarianism, that's the wrong word, but you know what I mean, liberal thinking would have dominated the world. And so the British were out to save the world from those two great evils. There were, of course, some preachers who didn't support the war. They were in a distinct minority, and only occasionally were their sermons reported. There was very aggressive censorship across all media in Australia during World War I. And the fact that any got printed is quite amazing. In particular, the Independent Australian Church of Melbourne, whose pastor was Dr. Charles Strong. He was a former Presbyterian who'd broken away from the Presbyterian Church. His ideas were too liberal for Presbyterianism, and he was aggressively against the war and said so. He didn't mince words. So apart from war themes, what were the other themes? National and imperial spirituality, moral renewal, and these were heavily intertwined with questions of theodicy. Where is God? What is he doing when the world is in such a horrific conflict? There was a widespread expectation amongst the Christian community that the war would see a spiritual revival. Everybody talked about it. It sort of happened and then sort of didn't. Doctrinal sermons took an initial dive. Everybody was busy preaching up the war. But by 1918, they form an astonishing 68% of the reported sermons. Sounds dramatic, doesn't it? But then sermon reporting had gone through the floor, and pretty well the only sermons being reported were evangelistic sermons. And by their very nature, evangelistic sermons tend to be doctrinal, theological based. And 2/3 of these doctrinal sermons in 1918 were reports from mainly Seventh-day Adventists, but also Theosophists, Unitarians, Christadelphians, and the modern spiritualists. Biblical prophecy was a hot topic. Obviously, the Adventist Church seized on the war to advance its agenda about end-time events. They were insistent, of course, that the war was not Armageddon. Many Christian groups said it was. The Adventists said, no, we know what will happen in the war. The Allies will capture Constantinople, now Istanbul, and according to prophecy, Turkey will establish its capital in Jerusalem. Of course, the Gallipoli campaign, yes, of course, they're going for Constantinople. And then it failed. And then in 1917, the British, with a little bit of help from the Aussies and Kiwis, captured Jerusalem. And all of a sudden, Adventist theology was in a tailspin. They had to backpedal quickly and revise their interpretations to make it fit the actual events, which is a bit of a warning on getting too specific with prophetic interpretation. Didn't stop many other groups, however, from insisting that this was Armageddon. Mission sermons, which I originally had a category for mission sermons, but pre-war they were just statistically insignificant. But by the end of the war, about 10% of the sermons recorded are mission sermons. And most churches ran mission outreaches to their communities. Catholic Church, the Anglicans, Baptists, Seventh-day Adventists, you name it. They put on these evangelistic meetings and they were rather well attended. Again, the war made them topical. So here it was, a revival of spiritual interest, but it didn't last. Another important theme that comes through is sectarianism. Now, again, secular histories make the point that one of the distinctive features of Australian Christianity was its vicious sectarianism. We're starting to moderate that opinion. And there's no doubt that sectarianism was evident in the newspaper reports. But it is a very minor theme. What is really obvious, and it might have been the reporters' biases, what is really obvious is the attempts by multiple church leaders and church groups to reach across denominational divides. The Uniting Church of Australia, I think it was 1977 they united. The attempts began before the First World War, and all through World War I you can see the Presbyterians, the Methodists and the Congregationalists trying to get together and present a united front about Christ. The reporting of sermons changed. With the start of the war, a lot of newspapers dropped their sermon reporting altogether. One of the reasons I chose the Melbourne Herald was it continued until early mid-1918. In the Herald, there was a drop from pre-war sermon reporting, from an average of about 90 sermons a year to about 60 or 70 sermons a year. That continued up until, I said, early 1918, when all of a sudden that column mostly disappeared, and all that happened was little reports from different churches, not so much sermon reports. And if there is a sermon report, it's by accident. Someone happened to mention that the Adventists were running an evangelistic campaign on X in such and such town hall. And so we find that what happens in 1918, this almost total collapse of reporting about sermons, replaced, as I mentioned, by the car, the great new fad. But the reporting of sermons came from the very minor groups, not just minor Christian denominations, but also non-Christian groups. Spiritualism, occultism, these were getting reports. Clearly the reporter had an affinity with alternative spirituality and spent his time covering that. So my conclusion is that some historians have claimed that the church was passive, that church attendance was declining during the war, and that churches neglected theology of war, and a searching moral inquiry because of the war. My conclusions show that this isn't true. The churches were active, they were proactive. There are multiple reports of increasing church attendance throughout the war, particularly because of the mission activities. Many churches ran a come back to church campaign, and they recorded its successes as the war progressed. And while there are no formal books of theology on the moral issue of war, there were so many sermons about the ethics of war and the morality of war. So definitely the churches were active in that way. What is obvious is that the preachers of Melbourne seized on the war to make religion and spirituality immediately relevant and practical. And they seem to have done that well. And I think what is true of Melbourne would probably hold true across the rest of Australia, even though the proportion of church attendees was probably a little different. As I mentioned, Melbourne was about 60% at the time. Sydney, we think about 40% of people went to church. The war re-energised preaching. It gave it a focal point. It allowed preachers to pull together all of their concerns into a single theme that they could then use to motivate their congregations to live more Christianly. All aspects of church life were invigorated. Spiritual and moral renewal, evangelism, theology, church attendance, national and imperial loyalty. And while sectarianism was promoted by the war, especially over conscription, there was also a much more visible push towards ecumenism. And the synthesis of these issues facilitated bringing religion into every sphere of the life of the Christian. Theodicy, interest in theodicy expanded, and this pushed more and more interest in the marginal Christian and the non-Christian spiritual bodies. Holiness and spiritual renewal were no longer personal matters. They were collective. They belonged to the nation. They were urgent. Increase in doctrinal sermons went along with greater evangelistic efforts. Prophecy was topical and therefore of great interest. The war heightened an awareness of the need to make religion relevant to men. And there are a number of sermons about the manliness of Christianity. There was also some talk of the role of women in religion. I was fascinated with the Theosophists because all of their leaders were women in Melbourne. And I was fascinated that their top speaker was able to talk about the brotherhood of spirituality as a female preacher. By 1918, however, the reporting of sermons focused around the fringes, and we see a dramatic decline in the reporting of sermons, which marks also a decline in actual church attendance. The irony is that the decade of the 1910s is the high point of the reporting of sermons in Australian newspapers. And it's also the decade that sees its dramatic collapse. Ironically then, the war sees a resurgence of the importance and influence of preaching and the first intimations that it is a fading voice. Thank you.
Daniel has been kind. He's left time for questions.
The question was, Charles Strong was aggressively anti-war. Is there any evidence that pro-war sermons encouraged young men to sign up? Yes, the answer is yes, definitely. Some of the most effective recruiters were clergy. Probably the most prominent was Canon Garland of Brisbane, who was an Anglo-Catholic, that is a very conservative Anglican, very, very proactive about the war, raised literally hundreds of thousands of pounds for the war effort, and was a national figure, and yeah, very influential. I've read many soldiers' letters to him from the front going, "We still remember what you told us back in camp. I'm not an Anglican, but I've still got your prayer book and I read it." Yeah. Right, so the newspaper I drew from was the Melbourne Herald, which was the biggest paper in Melbourne. I checked out as many of the other Melbourne papers as I could, and their sermon reporting was patchy. Interestingly enough, the most consistent sermon reporting paper that I found was the Newcastle Morning Herald. But it was in the supplement, and when the war began, of course, paper was rationed and they canned the supplement along with the sermon reporting. Yes, it is hard to tell about bias. The Melbourne Herald was a centre right-wing newspaper. Its sermon reporter was clearly on the religious left. So that's quite an interesting thing. The coverage of Anglicans should have got about 40% of the coverage. They were getting about 20% of the coverage. In the first year of the war, when the Anglican Church was the principal advocate of support for the war, it shot up to about 30%, and then it tails off back to 20 and below. Catholic Church, hardly any, but what would you expect given that, I mean, this was a time where if you were Protestant, you just didn't set foot in a Catholic Church, and vice versa. You just didn't. But there is some reporting of Catholic sermons. But no, he's really, really interested in the minor denominations, the Churches of Christ, the Baptists, and we're talking about 2 and 3%. If you're talking about Seventh-day Adventists who get, 6 or 8 sermons reported in 1918, they represent 0.0001% of Melbourne's population, and they're getting 5% of the sermon coverage. So, no, I don't think the editor had too much of a say, except when he pushed it from page 3 to somewhere else. It did bounce around a little bit during the war. 1918 was definitely condemned to the back pages, and the page 3 girl was the automobile. Was the state influenced by the church? Did the church abuse its influence? Given the context of the time, I'd have to say no, the church didn't abuse its influence. It was fulfilling what it saw as its divine role. Most of the churches, I've just done a study on the Adventist Church in World War I in another paper that I've just published, and one guy summarises the different positions of different denominations on church-state relationships. And it doesn't matter which way you cut it, all of them thought that church and state should work together. So the Anglicans thought the state should support an independent church. The Catholics thought the state was subject to the church. The Presbyterians thought that the church and the state ought to work together. The Methodists thought that the state really should follow the lead of the church's, outlook. But he never mentioned the Adventist position, which was the state and the church ought to be as far apart as they possibly can. So the idea that churches were heavily involved in the politics of the day. I come back to my point. If you were British, you thought the King Emperor was God's appointee. You thought Protestantism was ordained by God and that the empire was God's agent to bring salvation to the world. That might be abusive, but it was not manipulative or intended as abusive. Okay, to summarise your question, and you'll correct me if I've got it wrong, there were ecumenical movements before the war, major meetings. Did the war simply build on that, or did it bring something new to the energy? Probably a bit of both, but mainly the former. That is, the movement towards unity was accelerated by the war rather than the war bringing a new dimension to it. There was a sense in which people felt that Christianity should stand together, and that feeling was strongest amongst the soldiers at the front. But they were that way on nearly everything. While Australia was increasingly divided, bitterly divided, politically, religiously, socially, during the war, the soldiers kind of had this pact: we're here to win the war, anything that gets in the road, we're going to ignore. So they ignored politics. It's not that they stopped doing it, but they just wouldn't let it be a priority. They ignored religious differences. They got extremely angry against chaplains who promoted sectarianism. I have a record of a Bible study group at Gallipoli, which was attended by Anglicans, Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptists, Salvation Army, and Seventh-day Adventist. Now, I don't know what you know about 1914, but the idea of a Seventh-day Adventist attending a Bible study with those other religious groups was unthinkable, both from all the other religious groups' point of view and the Adventist point of view. And yet war brought them all together. It was the great hope of soldiers that this soldierly ecumenism would continue after the war. Instead, they came back to churches bitterly divided over the conscription issue, a society split in every way you can imagine, and they found themselves part of the political football that continued this divisive atmosphere for another 10 years after the war. Yes, so why the decline in reporting? What are the factors? I wish I knew, but I don't. And it's evident across all the newspapers. Most of the newspapers did it much earlier, much earlier. So the start of the war sees that decline, which just points to, if 1910 to 1919 is the biggest decade for sermon reporting in Australia, imagine how huge it was 1910 to 1914, because there is this drop-off during the war. So by 1918, it's hard to find a newspaper that has it as a regular feature. They'll have church news, but sermon reporting is kind of incidental, and I don't know the cause. Did reporting influence the preparation of sermons? Probably not, because they probably didn't know where the reporter would drop in next. As I said, there's 600 ministers, one reporter. What are your chances of being reported on this week? Obviously, he had congregations he preferred. He reported multiple times on Charles Strong's independent church, on a number of Seventh-day Adventist mission programs, and some of the better-known Presbyterian and Methodist churches. But no, they couldn't possibly know. He was probably also more likely to attend sermons where he knew the preacher was good. Okay, so how much did the issue of conscription feature in sermons? Quite a lot. In October 1916, and again in December 1917, Billy Hughes, the Prime Minister, asked Australians to vote on allowing compulsory military service conscription. Both times it was narrowly rejected, and Hughes was a personality who thought that conflict was the essence of life. So if he could provoke division and fighting, he was at his happiest. And conscription pulled together every political, religious and social issue in Australia into a single thing, much like the war pulled all different sermon topics in. There was a lot of preaching about conscription, and most of it was in favour. Some of it was bitterly against. The churches least likely to be supportive of conscription were the Methodists, the Congregationalists, and the Churches of Christ. But then they were the least enthusiastic about the war. They supported it, but a qualified support. The Anglicans, Presbyterians, Methodists, some Methodists, very enthusiastically in favour and preaching in favour. It's an interesting question, because trying to break down who voted for conscription and who voted against it, there are no clean lines. You find Catholics who voted for, even though Catholics were mostly considered to have voted against. You find Anglicans who vote against it, even though Anglicans are thought mostly to have voted for. You find upper class people voting against when they're thought to be in favour, working class people for, you know what I'm saying? It's really messy. And what it suggests is that the rhetoric, both the political and the religious rhetoric, is perhaps less influential on certain key issues that people hold to strongly. You couldn't sway people's minds. Once they were made up, we know that. Once people's minds are made up, it's hard to change their minds. And there are so many factors feeding into your support or opposition to conscription, including how many of your brothers are off at the war and how many are still left at home to support mum and dad. So many letters I've read by soldiers who go, I signed up, I'm glad I signed up, but please don't let my brother sign up. Don't let him over here. Really interesting.
All right, well, that was good, eh? I'm glad you came along, and thank you, Daniel. That was much appreciated. Always interesting. We have some interesting stuff coming up next semester, by the way. So a huge thank you and to Daniel.